On July 14th, 1789, a frenzied mob of Parisians attacked and overran the royal prison fortress known as the Bastille. With the fall of the Bastille, the French Revolution became a reality. A revolution by the French middle class, the bourgeoisie, against the privileged position of the king, the nobles, and the higher clergy. At first, the revolution did not seek a complete change in the structure of French society, but the principles on which it was based, individual freedom, the rule of law, democratic assemblies, and the separation of church and state, all threatened the power of the monarchy and the upper classes. The democratic fervor of the revolution also posed a threat to the established order in other European countries, where kings, nobles, and clergy ruled and exercised privileges little changed since the late Middle Ages. And so the revolution had enemies both inside and outside France, as its new parliamentary organ of government, the National Assembly, struggled to create a more democratic order. Inside France, there were fierce demonstrations against the king and the nobles on one hand, and royalist uprisings on the other. Many nobles fled to England, Austria, or Prussia, and from these sanctuaries plotted against the revolution. The French royal family, virtual prisoners of the revolution, appealed to other European monarchs for aid. By 1792, Austrian and Prussian armies were at French borders, and the English fleet was threatening French ports. In response to these pressures, the revolution became an iron dictatorship. The king and thousands of others suspected of opposition were put to death by the guillotine in a campaign known as the Terror. With the death of the king in 1792, the French Republic was proclaimed, amid blood and chaos. But the discipline of revolutionary dictatorship saved the revolution. Internal revolts were suppressed. The invading armies were beaten back, and French Republican armies began to push out into Europe, bringing revolutionary ideas with them. On October 6, 1795, there was yet another royalist revolt in Paris. But the commander of the troops guarding the capital was a cool-headed young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon ordered his men to fire on the royalist mob. 30 people were killed, the rest fled, and the revolt was over. 4 years later, through a military coup, Napoleon was to inherit the revolution and the government of France as first consul of the Republic. 9 years later, Napoleon was to be crowned Emperor of the French, and of a good part of Europe as well. 20 years later, having turned Europe and France upside down, Napoleon was to be banished for life to a tiny island in the South Atlantic, leaving behind him problems and questions that still have an echo today. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 in this house on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. His family, poor but influential, were of Italian origin, for Corsica itself had belonged to the Italian state of Genoa until 1768, when control over the island had passed to France. Napoleon was one of 8 children, and the Bonapartes were tightly bound by the kind of loyalty that still exists in large Italian families today. Because of this, for better or worse, Napoleon's brothers, sisters, and in-laws all came to play major roles in his career. Napoleon's father admired French culture and saw that the young Napoleon was educated in French military academies. Graduating at 16 and trained in the science of artillery, Napoleon was serving as a second lieutenant when the revolution broke out in 1789. Filled with revolutionary fervor, Napoleon returned to Corsica and led a revolt, hoping to liberate his homeland from the domination of nobles and priests. His attempts to do so were spread over 3 years and ended in fiasco. The entire Bonaparte family had to flee the island in 1792. But the turning point in Napoleon's career came a year later. Royalist plotters had allowed the English fleet to occupy Toulon, the chief French naval base in the Mediterranean. The English positions seemed impregnable. Thanks to connections in Paris, Napoleon was sent for to see what artillery might do. Napoleon devised a brilliant and daring tactical plan and carried it out in December 1793. The English were dislodged from Toulon, and Napoleon was now an important commander. Then, in October 1795, came his chance to save the Republic from Royalist insurrection. After that, Napoleon's future was assured, and he was given command of the Republican armies in Italy. At this time, there was no single Italian nation, but rather a collection of separate states. Many of the North Italian states were controlled by the Austrian Empire, which still hoped for the defeat of the French Republic and the restoration of the monarchy in France. So the two sides used northern Italy as a battlefield. In a series of brilliant campaigns during 1796 and 1797, Napoleon outthought and outfought the Austrians. "They've sent a young madman," complained one Austrian officer, "who attacks right, left, and from the rear. It's an intolerable way of making war." But Napoleon was not content with military victories. He saw himself not only as a general, but as a ruler, spreading enlightenment, progress, and reason to the territories he conquered. New states were set up in Italy, with republican constitutions that favored the interests of the bourgeoisie over those of the nobles. Feudal customs and privileges were abolished. At the same time, however, much of the wealth of Italy was plundered for the benefit of France. With the Austrians temporarily subdued, England remained the French Republic's most important enemy, and Napoleon was next given command of an army with which to invade England. But British control of the seas made such an attack far too risky. Instead, Napoleon decided to attack English interests in another direction, by establishing a French colony in Egypt. Egypt was then a somewhat backwater province of the Turkish Empire, but strategically important in terms of Eastern trade. In May 1798, a great French expedition with Napoleon in command landed near Alexandria. Back in Paris, the rulers of the Republic were glad that Napoleon had gone. The political situation in Paris was unstable. A number of generals and politicians were jockeying for position. While in France, Napoleon had avoided these intrigues, but his popularity was high after Italy, and the government feared his growing power. For his own part, Napoleon was only waiting for the right moment to strike, and he saw the Egyptian adventure as a way to increase his prestige. Instead, it was merely a disaster. The Egyptians posed no problem, but Napoleon suddenly found himself cut off when the British Admiral Nelson destroyed the French ships during the Battle of Aboukir Bay. On August 17, 1799, Napoleon secretly fled from Cairo, as this cartoon from the time shows, leaving his army to cope with a bad situation as best it could. He slipped aboard a French frigate near Alexandria, and a few weeks later was back in France, where despite his misadventures, he was hailed as a hero come to save his country. The France to which Napoleon returned was certainly in chaos. There were bread riots in the streets of Paris. Both royalists and radical extremists were plotting against the Republican government, and the Austrian army was threatening Napoleon's earlier conquests in Italy. Napoleon immediately began to plan a takeover of power. He was supported by a number of moderate leaders who felt that a strong military government was the only way to restore stability to France. The coup took place on November 9, 1799, when Napoleon managed to dissolve the French legislature by a combination of trickery and force. 3 consuls, with Napoleon at their head, were given a 10-year term of office. But the first consul, Napoleon, held most of the legislative and executive powers of the government. As first consul, Napoleon saw his main task as the imposition of order on the revolutionary chaos that France had suffered since 1789. But before he could reform France, he had to have peace on her borders, and this meant taking on Austria, England, and Russia. The Austrians were defeated in June 1800 at the Battle of Marengo, after Napoleon had led his forces in a dramatic march across the Alps. Meanwhile, Russia and Britain were quarreling, and the danger to France from those countries receded. By the beginning of 1802, Napoleon's victories had left France in possession of the territories shown on this map. Many European rulers, weary of war, might have been willing to accept these borders, the natural frontiers of France, as Napoleon called them, as long as no further conquests were attempted. And, for the moment, Napoleon did not attempt any. Instead, he turned to the internal reform of France. Many of Napoleon's reforms reversed principles established by the Revolution. Under the Republic, a great deal of power had been exercised by local government in the counties, or departments, of France. But under Napoleon, administrative and financial powers were controlled by the central government. A new class of officials, very like the professional civil servants of today, was created to run the government. The educational system of the country was also centralized. School subjects and standards were dictated by a new University of France. A bewildering variety of local, regional, and religious laws and customs was swept aside and replaced by a new code of law, the Code Civil, which became known as the Code Napoleon. All men were equal under this code, and justice was administered according to the law, rather than by the whims of men in power. This drawing represents Napoleon re-establishing the Catholic Church in France, for he also reversed the actions of the Revolution with regard to religion. The revolutionaries had seen the Church as an enemy of progress and freedom, and had separated the affairs of the Church from those of the state. Revolutionary governments had confiscated church wealth, and had downgraded the power and position of the clergy. But with the signing of the Concordat of 1801, concluded between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII, the Church was placed once again under official state protection. This policy brought many powerful conservative Catholics over to Napoleon's side. However, Napoleon's modern state also made use of considerable political repression. Early in 1800, Napoleon imposed strict censorship on the newspapers of Paris. If the press were not bridled, he said, I would not remain 3 days in power. In December 1800, the first consul narrowly escaped assassination when a bomb exploded near his carriage in a Paris street. Napoleon's secret police, for by then he had a secret police, staged nighttime raids to round up 150 left-wing Republicans who were known to have opposed his coup. All of them were jailed or deported. Later, when it was found that the bomb had in fact been a right-wing royalist plot, right-wingers were also jailed, but the left-wingers were not released. But the act which aroused most horror in Europe was the murder by firing squad of the Duke of Enghien in March 1804. Although innocent of any plot against Napoleon, the Duke, a member of the French royal family, was shot as an example to genuine royalist plotters outside France, whom Napoleon's police could not reach. Despite these touches of dictatorship, support for Napoleon among the mass of French people continued to grow. Inspired by his military victories and by the wealth and glory he was bringing to France, they had voted him consul for life in 1802. In 1804, the logical final step was taken. On December 2nd, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon was crowned Emperor of the French by the Pope. The splendid ceremonies recalled, as they were meant to, the Roman Empire at its height. The French Revolution had deposed a king, only to find an emperor. An emperor requires an empire, and Napoleon's ambitions could not remain satisfied with France, even a France that was clearly the dominant power in Europe. Napoleon wanted to control Europe, and through Europe to control colonial empires, and through these empires, the world. This is one view, at least, of why Europe was engaged in endless and bloody warfare during the whole of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon's boundless ambitions upset the balance of power in Europe, and had to be put down, whatever the cost. Napoleon himself had another view, that the rulers of Europe had been hostile to the French Revolution from the beginning, and still desired its defeat through war in order to protect their rule and their privileges from the principles of equality and enlightenment that the revolution carried in its wake. According to Napoleon, his wars were defensive wars, forced on him by Europe. His territorial gains were necessary to protect the frontiers of France. And where his armies conquered, men were liberated from oppression by the Code Napoleon and by enlightened administration. Whichever point of view is more correct, one fact remains beyond doubt. The most important, most persistent, and most dangerous obstacle to Napoleon's ambitions throughout his reign was England. The English had no army worth considering, but they did have control of the seas, as Admiral Nelson proved conclusively when he smashed French naval ambitions at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. As long as the English fleet remained in control of the oceans, Napoleon could not hope to invade and conquer England, nor could he expand France's empire overseas. The English also had enormous wealth, based on their industrial revolution, their overseas empire, and their foreign trade. Much of this wealth was poured into Europe to finance the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian armies in their struggle against Napoleon. Napoleon's plan was to undermine England's wealth by destroying English trade through an enormous blockade. English ships were to be prevented from trading at continental ports, thus preventing the English from making money through the sale of manufactured goods. But to enforce such a blockade, to conquer the sea from the land, as Napoleon put it, required the control of the whole of Europe. And this is what Napoleon set out to achieve. One by one, Napoleon took on his adversaries and defeated them in a series of brilliant campaigns. In October 1805, Napoleon decoyed, then defeated, a large Austrian army at Ulm. By early November, Napoleon was dictating terms from Vienna. A formidable Russian army then descended from the north, but Napoleon dealt it a crushing defeat at Austerlitz in December 1805, luring the Russians into a trap by a pretended retreat. In October 1806, a massive Prussian army was crushed at Jena, and Napoleon's troops occupied Berlin. The Russians, despite their defeat at Austerlitz, soon came back for more. In February 1807, the two armies fought an inconclusive battle in the snow at Eylau, with appalling casualties on both sides. But in June 1807, the Russian army was trapped at Friedland and destroyed. Peace was concluded when Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on a raft on the river Niemen. The Tsar, like the rest of Europe, was forced to concede most of Napoleon's terms. The territories now controlled by Napoleon in Europe are shown on this map. Under Napoleon, the face of Europe was to change at a rapid rate. Old empires were dismantled and new states created, and Napoleon was determined that control of the new Europe should be strictly a family affair. Early in 1806, Napoleon made his older brother Joseph king of Naples and Sicily. Also in 1806, brother Louis became king of Holland. In 1807, the youngest brother, Jerome, became king of Westphalia, one of the new states created by Napoleon in Germany, following the breakup of the old Holy Roman Empire. In a letter to Joseph at Naples, Napoleon dictated his aims for the new states and conquered territories: to abolish class distinctions and the relics of serfdom, to reform the laws and penal codes, and to establish justice and efficient administration. Napoleon's brothers, propped up only by the emperor's military might, were too self-seeking and inefficient to carry out these aims, and the imposition of the Bonaparte brothers as rulers aroused strong feelings of resentment in the conquered territories, feelings which took a nationalistic and anti-French shape. There were also feelings of resentment in France, for the wealth and young manhood of the country were being drained for Napoleon's military adventures. But for the mass of the French people, Napoleon had brought victories, plunder, and glory to France, and that was enough to ensure their loyalty and support. All Europe was subdued, and the blockade would soon finish the English. Progress and enlightenment had followed the French armies in every corner of Europe, and beyond Europe lay the world. By 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power as Emperor of France and conqueror of Europe. His continental enemies, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, had all been defeated in battle and forced to accept peace on Napoleon's terms. Only the English, and in particular the English fleet, still remained intact and unbeaten, committed to ending Napoleon's ambitions and restoring the traditional balance of power in Europe. Napoleon's domination of Europe was not due simply to his military genius or to the might of the French armies. People in every European country saw the emperor as a heroic figure who embodied the spirit of the age. Napoleon himself may have begun with the ideals of the French Revolution, but his dream was to revive the grandeur of the ancient Roman Empire, to unite all of Europe under his glorious and enlightened rule. This was a dream that fit in well with the artistic movement known as Romanticism, which was gathering strength in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. Romantic art was based on imagination and fantasy, and was concerned with the glorious, the dramatic, and the heroic. The personal feelings of the artist were given full and passionate expression. Painters such as David saw Napoleon as a hero on a white stallion, leading Europe out of the darkness of the Middle Ages. Beethoven, in a flush of enthusiasm, dedicated the symphony we have been hearing, called the Eroica, to Napoleon, though the composer retracted his dedication after the murder of the Duke of Enghien. Napoleon, in the Roman tradition, tried to set standards of artistic excellence through his patronage and encouragement of painters, writers, and composers throughout Europe. But Napoleon tended to prefer those artists who glorified the emperor's rule. Mademoiselle de Stael, a leading French author who criticized Napoleon, was exiled from France, and her books were banned from sale. Some of the most powerful art of the Napoleonic era was inspired by opposition to Napoleon's rule, as was this drawing by Goya, depicting the brutality of French soldiers in Spain. In fact, despite his military triumphs and his revival of Roman glories, the peace and the culture that Napoleon had forced upon Europe were distinctly fragile. His enemies, though beaten, were only waiting for the chance to strike back, waiting for the emperor to blunder. And Napoleon's first major blunder came in the spring of 1808 in Spain. Spain was ruled by a weak and simple-minded king named Charles IV. Though related to King Louis XVI of France, who had been murdered by the Revolution, Charles had been Napoleon's ally during the years of war in Europe. But now Napoleon sought even closer control over Spain, for the English were landing in Portugal and could threaten the French from the south. In addition, Napoleon feared any king whose family connections gave him a possible claim on the French throne. Through a combination of force and deceit, Napoleon led Charles to abdicate the Spanish throne and gave the crown to brother Joseph Bonaparte, who had been serving as King of Naples and Sicily. Napoleon's armies brought the usual reforms to what he called this backward, priest-ridden country. Feudal obligations were abolished, government was centralized and modernized, and the Spanish Inquisition, that infamous repressive arm of the Catholic Church, was destroyed. But the Spanish people reacted strongly against the arrogant imposition of a foreign king. Revolts broke out in May 1808, and the brutal methods used by Napoleon's troops to suppress them sparked off a fierce and costly guerrilla conflict. When Wellington led the English forces from Portugal into Spain, they found a populace ready to hail them and help them as liberators from Napoleon's tyranny. Napoleon's second major blunder concerned his relations with Pope Pius VII and the Catholic Church. In 1808, Napoleon's troops occupied Rome and the Papal States, which had always been considered the preserve of the Church. In 1809, Napoleon announced that these areas would now be governed by France. Pope Pius protested and excommunicated Napoleon from the Church. In reply, Napoleon had the Pope seized and imprisoned on French soil. Napoleon kept the Pope a prisoner for nearly 5 years in an attempt to force him to agree to a new Concordat, giving the Emperor total power over the Church. Though Europe could do little to interfere, the long, drawn-out spectacle of Napoleon trying to impose his will on the Pope shocked and angered Catholics in many countries, and gave inspiration to those who fought against the French. In July 1809, the Austrians tried their luck again on the field of battle, and were decisively crushed by Napoleon at Wagram. But things were not going well for Napoleon on other fronts. The King of Holland, Napoleon's brother Louis, who was under pressure from Dutch merchants, announced in 1810 that Holland would no longer support the trade blockade against the English. By the end of the year, Tsar Alexander I of Russia was also allowing British trade to enter Europe through the Baltic port of Riga. The blockade of England was the cornerstone of Napoleon's strategy, and it was suddenly full of holes. But the situation in Spain was even worse. English forces under Wellington inflicted a series of defeats on the French occupying troops. French men and money bled away into Spain, just when all these reverses were leading Napoleon toward his most desperate blunder of all, the invasion of Russia in 1812. At first, in the summer of 1812, the French army drove forward, pushing the Tsar's forces back. But the Russians burned their farms and towns as they retreated, leaving nothing the French could use for provisions. On September 1st, the Russians turned and fought at Borodino. It was a terrible battle which the French barely won. Napoleon lost 30,000 men and over 40 generals. Already in tatters, the French advanced to a burned and deserted Moscow. Then the Russian winter set in, and the French, with only a third of their original 450,000 men, began to retreat. The weather took a ghastly toll, and the Russian armies did the rest. The last of the French forces escaped the pursuing Russians by crossing the river Berezhna. At that point, Napoleon, leaving his armies as he had in Egypt, hastened back to Paris. "My army," said the Emperor with classic understatement, "has had some losses, due to the premature rigor of the climate." In fact, the Russian disaster exposed Napoleon militarily for the first time, and the rest of Europe moved in for the kill. Early in 1813, Wellington smashed the French armies in Spain, virtually driving them out of the country. At the 3-day Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the French suffered a terrible defeat, losing 40,000 men. By December, the Allies were invading France, and most of the European states Napoleon had established were in revolt. As Napoleon's empire collapsed around him, his support within Parisian high society evaporated. France was bankrupt and war-weary, and the aristocrats and bankers of Paris who had supported Napoleon's rise now decided to cut their losses. On April 3, 1814, the French Senate voted Napoleon out of office. The end came when Napoleon's marshals, his army commanders, withdrew their support. Napoleon was no longer in control of his armies, and his armies no longer controlled the state. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated his throne and left Paris on his way to the Mediterranean island of Elba, where he had been banished by the Allies. 2 weeks later, Louis XVIII arrived in France from England to re-establish the Bourbon dynasty on the French throne. The old order had been restored. Or had it? In November 1814, the Congress of Vienna opened in the Austrian capital. The royalty of Europe and their ministers were gathered to turn back the clock, to undo as many of Napoleon's reforms as they could, and to restore the European balance of power. And the Congress of Vienna was still meeting in March 1815, when Napoleon escaped from Elba, landed on French soil, and at once gathered an enthusiastic mob of supporters. Shrewdly, Napoleon presented himself not as the emperor, but as the spirit of the revolution, returned to unseat the Bourbons once again. Louis XVIII fled Paris, and the next day Napoleon was carried into the royal palace on the shoulders of his soldiers and the cheering Paris mob. But the dramatic return lasted for only 100 days, and ended with Napoleon's final defeat by the Allies, England, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Louis XVIII was soon back in Paris. This time the Allies made sure there would be no return. Napoleon was banished to the tiny island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the African coast and 5,000 miles from France. Napoleon was to live for another 6 years in uneventful exile on St. Helena. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, he died of cancer. For the next 3 decades, the forces of nationalism and progress which Napoleon had unleashed were ruthlessly suppressed by the crowned heads of Europe, until they burst forth in a spontaneous explosion in the revolutions of 1848. The rise and fall of Napoleon, because it was so brief and dramatic, puts the problem of historical interpretation into very sharp focus. For history is rarely a process of discovering a single truth. It is more often a matter of assessing different points of view. Among the points of view available in this instance is Napoleon's, set forth in exhaustive memoirs that he dictated on St. Helena. Napoleon's case is this. He was a son of the Revolution, a bringer of order, progress, and reform to France and to Europe, a conqueror only in self-defense, and a man whose vision of a united Europe of free peoples was spoiled by the envy of reactionary kings and of a greedy, money-mad England. Opponents of Napoleon have argued that he betrayed the principles of the French Revolution by suppressing the liberties fought for in 1789, and that his lust for conquest upset the balance of power in Europe, a balance that normally enabled Europeans to live at peace with one another. The argument, in other words, is whether Napoleon's rule furthered the cause of enlightenment and freedom in Europe, or whether he laid the foundations for modern dictatorship. The revolutionaries of 1789 had fought under the banner of liberty, equality, and brotherhood for all. Every Frenchman was seen as a free citizen in a society of equals. But, said Napoleon, liberty is the need of a small class, privileged with higher abilities than the rest of mankind. Equality, on the other hand, pleases the masses. So, under Napoleon, Frenchmen enjoyed certain civil rights they had not had before the Revolution. All men were equal under law. Class privileges were largely abolished. Talent could be rewarded regardless of birth. Education was much more widely available. But Napoleon restricted the political rights that had also been fought for in 1789. There was little freedom of speech. The press was censored. Education included government propaganda. And the government was not elected by the people, nor could it be legally changed by any kind of democratic process. The powers of the state, said a manifesto issued by the 3 consuls in 1799, must be strong and stable. The revolution is now finished. Napoleon felt that men were not capable of governing themselves. The democratic principles of the Revolution and the Republic, as he saw it, had led to chaos, instability, inefficient government, financial ruin, and military weakness. Order, prosperity, and military strength, Napoleon believed, could only be assured through a strong state, where the government controlled the lives of its citizens for the greater good of all. In France, the total control exercised by Napoleon's government brought about extensive changes. The centralization of government, with all decisions made in Paris and carried out uniformly throughout the country, created a new consciousness of a single French nation. Napoleon's victories on the battlefield not only united Frenchmen behind him, but reinforced their feelings for the nation, for France. The modern national state, which still predominates in world politics today, owes much to the national spirit forged in France by Napoleon. In Europe, Napoleon's military victories gave him the power to bring about political and social changes that might otherwise have taken decades, or never happened at all. Before Napoleon, for example, there was no German nation, but a motley collection of over 300 separate states, left over from the disorganization of the Middle Ages. Napoleon did away with most of these states and created the Confederation of the Rhine, a grouping of 30 larger areas that served as the base for the modern German nation, finally united in 1871. In Italy, Napoleon's new Italian republics were the foundation on which the modern Italian nation was eventually created. But even more important for the creation of modern nation-states in Europe was the introduction of the Code Napoleon and the abolition of feudal customs and privileges wherever Napoleon conquered. By removing power from aristocratic and hereditary rulers and investing it instead in courts, codes of law, and organs of state government, Napoleon created the preconditions for the emergence of nations as we know them today. Ironically, however, the greatest impetus for the emergence of modern nations in Europe was often opposition to Napoleon's rule. The awakening of fervent nationalistic consciousness usually accompanied the resistance to Napoleon that sprang up in many parts of the continent. Under Napoleon, the people of Europe had no say in how they were governed. Reforms were imposed on them from above. Also, they were equally powerless to stop the emperor turning Europe into a bloody field of battle for the whole of his brief reign. The slaughter was terrible. The loss in money and resources was enormous. And the cause? Napoleon's desire to impose his will on as many people as possible. Admiral Nelson, a few months before he was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, wrote, "Never was the probability of universal monarchy more nearly realized than in the person of Napoleon."